Okay, to wrap up this module, we covered a number of things. First off, we reviewed the fact that the default source for a binding is always the data context. And for the vast majority of data binding scenarios, you're going to use the data context as your source object. But there's specialized scenarios where you need more control. And so we looked at the relative source binding as one way to do that, where you can reference other elements in the visual tree through a relative path within the tree. You use the relative source markup extension and the property on the binding. You can use the self mode to point to the same element that the binding is on, or you can use the ancestor type to point to a parent element somewhere up the tree, looking for a match based on the type of that element. Covered the element name binding as another way to get an explicit source object for your binding by pointing to some other element within the visual tree that has a name on it, and it doesn't necessarily have to be an explicit ancestor of the element that you're on. Then we looked at the source binding, and the source binding allows you to explicitly point to some object that you have to place within a resource dictionary and then get to it through a static resource or dynamic resource markup extension that points to that object. Then that can become the source object for your binding. Next, we looked at property paths in a little more detail, and we saw that there's a number of forms it can take on. You can have a simple property name on the source object. You can have a dot, which means the whole source object. You can exclude the path, which means the same as the dot, or you can have a complex path that starts with a property name on the source object, but then dots down through an object hierarchy, even indexing into arrays as part of that path syntax. We covered the directionality of bindings, the fact that they are one way by default, where the data flows from the source to the target at initial binding time and when property change notifications occur. But you can use two-way bindings, either explicitly by setting the mode property, or if you're on an edit control with the primary edit property, such as text on a text box, those properties can be declared to be two-way by default. And the way you do that default declaration is through the metadata of the dependency property that's going to end up being the target property on that element. And we saw how you can declare that yourself if you're writing a custom control with properties that you expect people to bind to.